Welcome back to the shadows with angelical balance. Tonight, a Yellowstone park ranger horror story that'll make you think twice about wandering off the trail or trusting the ones sworn to protect it. If these deep woods nightmares are your poison, smash subscribe, ring the bell, and drop a like. It keeps the darkness growing. Lights out, windows checked. The Yellowstone Park Ranger horror begins now. Some places aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be respected from a distance, observed with caution, and above all, never underestimated. Yellowstone National Park is one of those places. Most visitors see the geysers, the wildlife, the pristine forests stretching endlessly under big sky country sunlight. They take their photos, buy their souvenirs, and leave with memories of a perfect American wilderness. But for those of us who work there, who stay after the tourists drive away, who walk those trails when darkness settles like a heavy blanket over 2 million acres of untamed land, we know different. My name is Marcus Webb, and I spent 8 years as a backcountry ranger at Yellowstone. I'm telling you this story now because I left the Park Service 3 months ago, and because what happened during my final season there has been eating away at me ever since. I've tried to rationalize it, tried to explain it away with logic and science and all the things we're supposed to believe in. But some experiences change the way you see the world. And what I encountered in the Thorofare region in the summer of 2019 was one of those experiences. I need you to understand something before I go any further. Park rangers aren't supposed to talk about certain things. There's an unspoken agreement, a kind of institutional silence about the incidents that don't make it into official reports. Missing persons who are never found. Strange sounds recorded on trail cameras that biologists can't identify.
Areas of the park where even the most experienced rangers feel an inexplicable sense of dread. We don't talk about these things because we don't want to scare people, and because most of the time we don't have any answers. But this story isn't about protecting the park's reputation. It's about what's really out there, in those vast stretches of wilderness where cell phones don't work and help can be days away. It's about the price of forgetting that we're not at the top of the food chain, not really, and that nature has secrets that predate our understanding by millennia. It started in late June, right at the beginning of the busy season. I was stationed at the Thorofare Ranger Station, the most remote ranger station in the lower 48 states. To get there, you either hike 32 miles from the nearest trailhead or arrange for a helicopter drop, which we only did for emergencies or essential supply runs. The isolation was exactly what I'd wanted when I requested the posting. After years of dealing with tourists at more accessible locations, I craved the solitude, the challenge of being truly self-sufficient in one of the most pristine wilderness areas left in America. The Thorofare region sits in the southeastern corner of Yellowstone, where Wyoming's Teton Wilderness butts up against the park boundary. It's grizzly country, wolf country, a place where megafauna still roam in numbers that would have been familiar to Lewis and Clark. The Yellowstone River runs through it, cold and clear, and the meadows in summer are carpeted with wildflowers that stretch to the horizon. It's breathtakingly beautiful, the kind of place that makes you believe in something larger than yourself. I wasn't alone out there. My partner that summer was a younger ranger named Sarah Chen, a wildlife biologist who transferred from Olympic National Park. She was competent, quiet, and shared my appreciation for the backcountry's demands. We settled into a comfortable routine those first few weeks. Monitoring trail conditions, checking on campsites, documenting wildlife activity, and occasionally assisting the handful of backpackers who made it out that far. The station itself was basic but functional. A log cabin with solar panels, a propane stove, and a satellite phone for emergencies. We had a storage shed, a small barn for the pack horses we'd sometimes use for longer patrols, and an outhouse that Sarah had decorated with wildflowers, which I found oddly charming. At night, we'd sit on the porch and watch the stars emerge in numbers that city dwellers can't imagine, listening to the howls of wolves echoing across the valleys. It was paradise in its way, until the disappearances started. The first one we heard about came over the satellite phone on July 2nd. A solo hiker named David Brennan, 43, from Boulder, Colorado, had failed to check in at the ranger station at Heart Lake, about 20 miles northwest of our position. He'd registered for a week-long backpacking trip through the Thorofare, with planned stops at designated campsites along the way.
His wife had reported him overdue, and a search was being organized. This wasn't unusual in itself. Every summer someone gets turned around, sprains an ankle, or simply misjudges the difficulty of Yellowstone's backcountry. Most of the time they turn up tired and embarrassed, but fine. Sarah and I joined the search effort, covering the southern sections of Brennan's planned route. We found his camp on the third day. It was at Site 8T4, a beautiful spot near Bridger Lake where the morning light turns the water silver. His tent was still standing, properly secured with all the bear precautions in place. His food was hung correctly in a bear-proof canister 15 feet up a tree.
His sleeping bag was laid out inside the tent, his pack neatly organized, with clothes folded and equipment stored with the precision of an experienced backpacker. But David Brennan was gone. What struck me immediately was how undisturbed everything was. When people get lost or injured, they usually take supplies with them, or there are signs of hasty departure. This looked like he'd simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. His boots were missing, but his expensive hiking poles were leaning against a tree. His journal sat on a flat rock near the fire ring, closed, with a pen laid across it as a bookmark. Sarah photographed everything while I searched the surrounding area for tracks. The ground was soft near the lakeshore, perfect for prints, and I found his boot tracks easily enough. They led down to the water's edge, where it looked like he'd knelt to fill his water bottle. But then they just stopped. Not like they were washed away or obscured. They simply ended, as if he'd knelt there and then vanished into thin air. "Marcus, come look at this." Sarah's voice had an edge to it I hadn't heard before. She was standing by the fire ring, pointing at his journal. She'd opened it, standard procedure for missing persons cases, looking for clues about his mental state or plans. The last entry was dated July 1st, the day before he was supposed to check in at Heart Lake. I read it over her shoulder, and I can still quote it from memory because of how deeply it unsettled me. Day 5 in the Thorofare. This place is everything I hoped it would be. Saw a grizzly with 2 cubs this morning, kept my distance. The solitude out here is profound. Makes you realize how much noise we carry with us in regular life. Tonight I'll camp at Bridger Lake. There's something about this area, though. Can't quite put my finger on it. The birds went quiet around 4 p.m., and they still haven't started up again. Not even the insects. The silence is total.
Beautiful, but also somehow wrong. Like the forest is holding its breath. Probably just my imagination. Going to turn in early. Need to make miles tomorrow. That was it. The entry just stopped mid-thought, as if he'd been interrupted. The search continued for another week. We brought in additional rangers, search and rescue teams, helicopters with thermal imaging. We covered every square mile of his planned route and expanded the search radius to areas he couldn't possibly have reached on foot. We found nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no blood, no signs of bear or wolf predation. David Brennan had simply ceased to exist. The official report listed him as lost in the wilderness, presumed deceased due to misadventure. His case file was closed after 30 days. His wife came to collect his belongings, and I had to look her in the eyes and tell her I didn't know what had happened to her husband. The helplessness I felt in that moment still haunts me. Sarah and I returned to the Thorofare station, shaken but trying to maintain our professional composure. We'd both been through search and rescue operations before. Sometimes people die in the wilderness. It's a hard truth of working in places like this. But something about this case felt different, and I could see the same unease in Sarah's eyes when we talked about it. "The silence he mentioned," she said one night as we sat on the porch. "I've noticed it too. There are times when everything just stops. No bird song, no insects, nothing. And it's always in the late afternoon, around the same time he mentioned." I'd noticed it too, though I'd been trying to ignore it. In a healthy ecosystem, there's always ambient noise. Wind through the trees, birds calling, the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush. But there were moments, growing more frequent, when the forest would fall into an absolute silence so profound it felt like being underwater.
It never lasted more than 15 or 20 minutes, but during those periods, the air itself seemed to thicken, and every instinct I had screamed at me to get inside, to hide, to make myself small and invisible. We tried to rationalize it.
Maybe it was a predator moving through the area, something large enough to silence the smaller animals. Grizzlies could have that effect, and we knew there were several in the region. But grizzlies don't move on a schedule, and the silence was becoming predictable, occurring almost daily between 4 and 5 in the afternoon. 3 weeks after David Brennan disappeared, we got word of another missing person. This time it was a young woman named Emily Rodriguez, 26, an experienced mountaineer from Seattle who'd been solo hiking the Continental Divide Trail through Yellowstone. She'd last been seen at the Snake River Ranger Station, heading south into the Thorofare. Sarah and I looked at each other when we got the call. We both knew what the other was thinking, though neither of us wanted to say it out loud. This wasn't a coincidence. We found Emily's camp 4 days later, at Site 8T7, less than 3 miles from where we'd found David Brennan's. The setup was nearly identical. Tent properly erected, food properly stored, gear neatly organized, and Emily Rodriguez was nowhere to be found. Her journal was open on a camp chair, and the last entry made my blood run cold. Something's not right here. It's 4:30 p.m. and the forest has gone completely silent. Not a single sound except my own heartbeat. I keep feeling like I'm being watched, but every time I turn around, there's nothing there. The trees seem different somehow, like they're leaning in closer than they should be. I know that sounds crazy. Maybe I'm just spooked because I'm alone out here, but I swear I saw something moving between the trees about an hour ago. Something big, but wrong somehow. The shape wasn't right. I'm going to pack up and hike to the ranger station. I know it's getting late, but I don't want to spend another night. The entry ended mid-sentence. The pen was still lying on the page. Sarah picked up the journal with shaking hands. Marcus, this is exactly like Brennan's camp. Everything in place, person just gone. And she mentions the silence too. And seeing something. I was already scanning the tree line, my hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on my hip. The forest around us was alive with normal sounds. Birds, a distant woodpecker, the rustle of wind through pine needles. But I knew that could change. I'd felt it often enough now to recognize the warning signs, that subtle shift in air pressure that preceded the silence. We need to call this in, I said, and we need to leave. Now. We documented the scene quickly, taking photos and GPS coordinates, but I rushed us through it. The sun was already low on the horizon, and the last thing I wanted was to be in this area when that unnatural quiet descended. We hiked fast, faster than was probably safe, and made it back to the ranger station just as twilight was settling over the valley. That night, neither of us slept well. I could hear Sarah tossing in her bunk across the cabin's single room. Around 3 in the morning, I heard her get up and start making coffee. "Can't sleep either?" she asked when she saw I was awake. No, I joined her at the small table. "Sarah, what do you think is happening out there?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee mug. "I've been going over everything I know about predator behavior, about how animals respond to threats. The silence pattern, the way it happens at the same time each day. It's like something is hunting on a schedule. Something big enough to make everything else go quiet." "Grizzlies don't hunt on schedules," I said.
No, they don't. She looked up at me, and in the dim light of the propane lamp, I could see the fear in her eyes. "Marcus, I don't think this is an animal. At least not one we have documented." I wanted to dismiss it, to laugh it off as stress and overactive imaginations. But I couldn't, because deep down, I'd been thinking the same thing. There were too many stories from old-timers, too many Native American legends about the Yellowstone backcountry, too many incidents that never made it into official reports, things that rangers whispered about late at night, but never discussed in daylight. The next morning, we got a visit from Chief Ranger Tom Morrison. He'd flown in by helicopter, which was unusual. Tom was a 30-year veteran of the Park Service, a man who'd seen everything and wasn't easily rattled. But when he sat down at our table, I could see the tension in his shoulders. "We're pulling you two out," he said without preamble, "temporarily, until we figure out what's going on." "What about the investigation?" Sarah asked. "Someone needs to be out here searching." "Search and rescue is suspended in the Thorofare, effective immediately." Tom pulled out a map and spread it on the table. He'd marked several locations with red X's. "These are all the places where we've had disappearances in this region over the past 15 years. 11 people, Sarah. 11 people have vanished from a 20-square-mile area, all during summer months, all in the late afternoon or early evening." I stared at the map. The
red marks clustered around the Thorofare, concentrated near Bridger Lake in the upper Yellowstone River Valley. Why didn't anyone notice the pattern before? Because they weren't all in the same season, and the cases were spread out over more than a decade. But I started going through old reports after Brennan disappeared, looking for similarities.
And I found them. He pointed to the earliest mark on the map. This one was in 2004. A ranger named Bill Kowalski. He was doing a solo patrol. Never checked in. We found his radio, his pack, everything. Never found him. Did anyone investigate whether these cases might be connected? Sarah asked. Tom's expression grew darker. There was an investigation. Off the books. A team came out from Fish and Wildlife, a couple of guys from the FBI's Violent Crimes Unit. They spent 3 weeks out here in 2012, after 3 disappearances happened within a single summer. They left and filed a report that was immediately classified. I never saw it, but I talked to one of the agents years later, after he'd retired. He was drunk, and I probably shouldn't have pushed him, but I did.
What did he tell you?
I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. He said they found evidence of something they couldn't explain. Tracks that didn't match any known species. Recordings of sounds that didn't fit any animal in their database. And one of their team members had some kind of breakdown on the last day. Started screaming about something he saw in the trees. They airlifted him out, and he never came back to work. Tom folded the map carefully. The official conclusion was that the disappearances were likely due to a combination of bear attacks, falls, and people getting lost. But that agent told me he didn't believe a word of it. He said there was something in the Thorofare that they couldn't identify and couldn't catch, and the decision was made to classify the findings because there was no good way to explain it to the public. The cabin fell silent. Outside, I could hear the normal sounds of morning, birds singing, the wind through the trees, but all I could think about what would happen when 4 o'clock rolled around. "So what do we do?" Sarah asked quietly. "Like I said, we're pulling you out. Helicopter's coming back this afternoon at 2.
Pack your essentials. Tom stood up, then hesitated. Off the record, if I were you two, I'd consider requesting a transfer. There are other places to work, places that aren't. He trailed off, searching for the right word. Haunted, I suggested. He didn't disagree. After Tom left, Sarah and I began packing in silence. But as I rolled up my sleeping bag and organized my gear, a thought kept nagging at me. 11 people over 15 years. 11 families without answers, without closure. And now we were just going to leave, to close our eyes and pretend nothing was wrong? I can't do it, I said suddenly. I can't just leave without trying to understand what's happening. Sarah looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Marcus, didn't you hear what Tom just said? There's something out there that's been hunting people for 15 years, something that made FBI agents classify their findings, and you want to stay and investigate? Not investigate. Observe. I pulled out our trail camera, one of the motion-activated cameras we used for wildlife monitoring. We have 6 of these. What if we set them up around the area where the disappearances happened? We could get them in place this morning, and back here before the helicopter arrives, and then review the footage later from somewhere safe. That's insane, Sarah said, but I could see she was considering it. We'd have to move fast, and we'd need to be out of that area by 3 at the latest. Agreed. We spent the next 20 minutes planning our route. We'd take the horses, faster than hiking, and they could carry all the cameras. We'd set up a perimeter around Site 8T7, Emily Rodriguez's last camp, spacing the cameras about 50 yards apart to cover the most ground. If something was out there, if it came back to that area, maybe we'd finally get a glimpse of it. By 9 a.m., we were in the saddle and heading north.
The morning was beautiful, one of those perfect Yellowstone days where the sky seems impossibly blue and the meadows are alive with color. It was hard to reconcile that beauty with the dread growing in my chest. We reached the site by 11 and worked quickly, mounting the cameras on trees at various heights and angles. Each one was camouflaged, designed to be invisible to wildlife. We set them to activate on motion and to record in infrared for night vision. If anything larger than a squirrel moved through this area in the next week, we'd have footage of it. Sarah was mounting the last camera when I heard it, or rather when I stopped hearing everything else. The silence descended like a physical weight,
so sudden and complete it made my ears ring. I checked my watch. It was 12:47 p.m. "Sarah," I said quietly, "it's happening." She went still on the tree, clinging to the trunk. "It's early. It's never been this early." The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind. Even the horses had gone completely still, their ears pinned back, their eyes rolling white with fear. I'd seen horses spook before, but this was different. This was primal terror. And then I saw it. At first I thought it was just the way shadows fell between the trees, a trick of light and darkness. But as I stared, the shape began to separate itself from the surrounding forest. It was standing about 70 yards away, partially obscured by pine trunks, but I could make out enough to know that it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen. It was massive, at least 8 or 9 feet tall, with a body structure that seemed almost humanoid, but wrong in ways I struggled to process. The limbs were too long, jointed in places they shouldn't be. The head was elongated, though I couldn't make out details. But it was the way it moved that turned my blood to ice.
It didn't walk so much as flow between the trees, its movements smooth and predatory, like a spider or a mantis, utterly silent despite its size. And it was watching us. I felt its gaze like a physical pressure, even though I couldn't see its eyes. Sarah had frozen on the tree, and I knew she was seeing it too. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get on the horse and ride as fast as possible back to the station. But I also knew that running could trigger a chase response. I'd seen it with bears. Sometimes standing your ground was the only option. "Don't move," I whispered to Sarah. "Don't make eye contact." The thing tilted its head, and I heard a sound that I can only describe as clicking, like bamboo striking bamboo, but with an organic wetness to it. It took a step closer, and I could see now that its skin, if it was skin, had a strange texture, almost like bark or lichen, providing perfect camouflage against the forest backdrop. My hand was on my bear spray, though I doubted it would do any good. The canister suddenly felt as useless as a water pistol. The thing took another step, then another, emerging more fully from the trees. I could see now that it had multiple limbs, more than 4, maybe 6 or 8, though they folded against its body in ways that defied normal anatomy. The horses broke first. My mount reared with a scream of terror and bolted, Sarah's following immediately after. The sudden movement seemed to trigger something in the creature. It moved fast, faster than anything that size should be able to move, flowing across the ground with that horrible insectoid grace. "Run!" I shouted to Sarah. She jumped from the tree and we ran, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for stealth or direction. Behind us I could hear it coming, that clicking sound growing louder, punctuated by the crack of branches breaking. But there was something else too, a smell, sharp and chemical, like ozone mixed with rotting vegetation. I grabbed Sarah's hand and we veered left, heading toward a rocky outcropping I remembered from our earlier reconnaissance. It was a steep climb, maybe 20 feet of exposed granite, but it would give us elevation and a vantage point. We scrambled up, our hands bleeding on the rough stone, and pressed ourselves into a crevice near the top. Below us, the forest had gone quiet again. The clicking had stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but our ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then I saw it step out of the tree line. In full sunlight, it was even more terrifying. Its body seemed to shift and change, colors flowing across its surface like oil on water. The head was elongated and featureless, no eyes or mouth that I could see, just smooth darkness. But I knew it was aware of us, could feel its attention like heat from a lamp. It approached the base of the rocks and stopped, tilting its head back to look up at us. For several minutes it just stood there, utterly still. Then it reached up with one of its limbs, I counted 6 total now, and placed it against the rock. The limb was easily 8 feet long, ending in something that looked like a hand, but with too many fingers, each one tipped with something dark and sharp. It began to climb. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. The creature moved up the rock face with the same fluid grace it had shown on the ground, its multiple limbs finding purchase on surfaces that looked completely smooth. It made no sound except for that periodic clicking, which I now realized might be some form of echolocation or communication. I pulled out my radio, knowing it was probably futile, but having to try. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Webb at Thorofare. We have an emergency situation. We are under attack by an unknown..." Static.
The radio was completely dead.
I tried the satellite phone in my pack, but it wouldn't even power on, despite having been fully charged that morning. Whatever this thing was, it seemed to disrupt electronics. "Marcus, look," Sarah pointed to the side of the outcropping. There was a narrow gap between two large boulders, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It appeared to lead deeper into the rock formation, possibly to a cave or crevice where we could take shelter. It was a desperate option, but staying on this exposed ledge meant being within reach of that thing in less than a minute. "Go," I said. "I'm right behind you." Sarah slipped into the gap sideways, and I followed, scraping my shoulders against the rough stone. The passage was tight and dark, but it opened up after about 10 feet into a small cave, maybe 6 feet across and 4 feet high. We couldn't stand, but we could crouch, and most importantly, the entrance was too narrow for something the size of that creature to follow. We pressed ourselves against the back wall, breathing hard, waiting. Outside, the clicking had stopped. For a long moment, there was absolute silence. Then I heard a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. Something scraping against the rock at the cave entrance, probing, testing. One of those elongated limbs pushed through the gap, the too many-fingered hand stretching and flexing, reaching into the darkness where we hid. It couldn't reach us. We were just far enough back, just barely out of range. The limb withdrew, and then came that clicking again, louder now, echoing in the small space. It sounded almost frustrated, if such a thing could be frustrated. The scraping continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Then suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds had been. We waited, barely daring to breathe, straining our ears for any indication of where the creature had gone.
Minutes stretched into an hour. My legs were cramping from the awkward crouch, and I could see Sarah was in similar discomfort, but neither of us dared move. Finally, I heard it. Normal forest sounds returning. Birds beginning to call, insects resuming their drone. The oppressive silence had lifted. Whatever that thing was, it had left. "We need to wait," I whispered to Sarah. "Make sure it's really gone." She nodded, her face pale in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance. We waited another hour, until I was confident that the normal rhythms of the forest had fully returned. Then, slowly, painfully, we crawled back through the narrow passage and emerged onto the rocky outcropping. The sun was still high in the sky. It was only 2:30. We'd missed our helicopter extraction by half an hour, but that was the least of our concerns. I scanned the forest below, looking for any sign of the creature. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, shafts of sunlight illuminating the forest floor in golden patches. It looked peaceful, idyllic, completely innocent. "The cameras," Sarah said hoarsely. "We got it on the cameras, right?" I nodded slowly. If they survived. If it didn't destroy them. We climbed down from the rocks carefully, every sense on high alert. The horses were long gone, probably halfway back to the station by now if they hadn't been caught. That meant we were on foot, with at least a 4-hour hike ahead of us. But first, I wanted to check those cameras. 3 of them had been torn from the trees, the mounting brackets bent and twisted with what must have been incredible strength. But the other 3 were still in place, their red recording lights blinking steadily. I retrieved them with shaking hands, slipping the memory cards into my pocket. "Let's move," I said, "fast as we can. I want to be back at the station before dark." We set a brutal pace, jogging when the terrain allowed, walking fast when it didn't.
My back itched the entire time, convinced I could feel eyes watching us from the shadows between the trees. But the forest remained alive with normal sounds, and we saw nothing unusual, just pine trees and meadows and the occasional elk in the distance. We reached the ranger station at 6 p.m., exhausted and dehydrated but alive. Both horses were there, standing in the small corral, still wild-eyed and skittish. I'd never been so happy to see our ramshackle cabin. Inside, Sarah immediately tried the satellite phone, while I checked our regular radio. Both were working fine now. Whatever interference we'd experienced in that area apparently localized. Tom Morrison's voice crackled over the radio almost immediately. "Webb, Chen, where the hell have you been? The helicopter crew waited for 30 minutes. We were about to send another search party." "Sir, we encountered something in the field. We need immediate extraction and we have evidence, critical evidence." There was a pause. What kind of something? the kind that explains all those disappearances. Sir, we need that helicopter back here now, and we need it to come armed. Armed? Marcus, what are you talking about? Please, sir, just trust me. We have it on camera. Get us out of here tonight. Another long pause. Okay, I'll have a chopper there at first light. That's the earliest I can manage. Can you make it until then? I looked at Sarah. She nodded grimly. Yes, sir. We'll bunker down and stay inside. But Tom, whatever you do, don't send anyone else out here alone. Not until you've seen what we've recorded. Copy that. Stay safe. Morrison out. We spent the next hour fortifying the cabin as best we could. We pushed our bunks against the door and windows, gathered all our bear spray and flares, and made sure every entrance was secured. Then, as the sun began to set, I plugged the memory cards into my laptop.
The first 2 cameras showed nothing unusual, just normal forest scenes, the occasional bird or squirrel triggering the motion sensors. But the third camera, the one positioned closest to where we'd had our encounter, had captured something. The footage was grainy, and the creature's camouflage made it hard to see at first, but there it was. It appeared at 12:44 p.m., 3 minutes before we'd noticed the silence descending. It moved through the frames slowly, methodically, and watching it on video was somehow even more disturbing than seeing it in person. The camera had captured details I'd missed in my panic. The way its limbs bent at those impossible angles, the way its head moved independently of its body, scanning back and forth. And the size of it. On video, with trees for reference, I could see it was even larger than I thought. Easily 9 feet tall, maybe more. Sarah pointed at the screen. Pause it there. I froze the frame. The creature had turned toward our direction, and for just a moment, its head was in profile against a patch of sunlight. What I'd thought was a featureless surface wasn't. There were structures there, ridges and protrusions that might have been sensory organs, and something that could have been eyes, though they were nothing like any eyes I'd ever seen. Just dark pits that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "What is it?" Sarah whispered. "Is it alien? Some kind of cryptid? An unknown species? I don't know. But look at this." I advanced the footage frame by frame. See how it moves? It's not random. It's searching, methodically checking the area in a grid pattern. It's hunting. We watched the rest of the footage in silence. The creature appeared on 2 more cameras, always moving with that same purposeful search pattern. Then at 1:15 p.m., it suddenly stopped and turned directly toward where we'd been standing.
The next few minutes showed it moving rapidly in our direction, and then the camera angle was wrong to capture what happened next. But the final camera, the one I'd mounted highest in a tree to get an aerial view, had caught everything. It showed us running, showed the creature pursuing, showed our desperate climb up the rocks, and it showed something else, something that made my blood run cold. There wasn't just one of them. At the edge of the frame, partially obscured by trees, I could see at least 2 more of the creatures. They were smaller, maybe 6 or 7 feet tall, and they weren't pursuing us. They were just watching, observing, like they were studying us, or perhaps learning from the larger one's hunting technique. "Oh God," Sarah breathed. "Marcus, there's more than one. There's a whole group of them." I sat back from the laptop, my mind racing. This changed everything. One unknown creature was terrifying enough, but multiple individuals suggested a population, possibly even a social structure. These things had been in Yellowstone for at least 15 years, probably much longer. They'd developed hunting patterns, territory, possibly even culture. And they'd been taking people with impunity because no one knew they existed. "We need to go public with this," Sarah said. "We can't let them bury this like they did the last investigation. They'll take the footage, classify it, maybe even make us sign non-disclosure agreements. Then we make copies, multiple copies. We send them to news outlets, to scientists, to anyone who will listen." She was animated now, angry. 11 people, Marcus. 11 people have died, and no one did anything because it was easier to pretend there wasn't a problem. We can't let that happen again. I knew she was right, but I also knew how the government worked, how institutions protected themselves. Still, we had evidence now. Real, undeniable evidence.
Even if they tried to suppress it, the truth would get out eventually. We spent the next hours making copies of the footage, uploading it to encrypted cloud storage, emailing it to trusted colleagues and journalists. If Tom or anyone else tried to confiscate our evidence, we'd have backups they couldn't touch. As night fell fully, we sat in the dim light of the propane lamp, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made us jump. Around 9 p.m., the forest went silent. Sarah and I looked at each other. We both knew what it meant. They were out there. I turned off the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. Through the gaps in the window shutters, I could see moonlight illuminating the clearing around the station. Nothing moved. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Minutes passed. 10, 20, 30. Then I saw it. A shadow moved across the clearing, impossibly tall, impossibly wrong. It approached the cabin slowly, and I could hear that clicking sound now, muffled by the walls but still audible. It stopped about 15 feet from the door. Sarah had her hand over her mouth, stifling any sound. We both barely breathed. The clicking came again, louder, and then I heard something else, a sound like wood creaking under pressure. Something was testing the cabin walls, pushing against them, searching for weaknesses. The outer wall groaned. Dust fell from the ceiling rafters. One of the window shutters rattled in its frame. The thing was circling the cabin now, probing every surface, and I realized with sick certainty that our barricades wouldn't stop it if it really wanted to get in. The logs were thick, the construction solid, but against something with that kind of strength, the cabin was just kindling, waiting to be torn apart. But it didn't attack. After circling the cabin twice, the sound stopped. The shadow moved away, back toward the tree line. And slowly, gradually, the normal sounds of the night returned. We didn't sleep. We sat with our backs against the bunks we pushed against the door, weapons at hand, waiting for dawn. Every sound made us tense, but the creature didn't return, at least not that we could detect. When the first light of morning began to filter through the shutters, we heard the most beautiful sound imaginable, the whup, whup, whup of helicopter rotors in the distance. The chopper landed in the clearing at 6 a.m., and we were out the door and running for it before the skids even touched ground. Tom Morrison was aboard, along with 2 armed rangers I didn't recognize. They looked ex-military, and they were carrying rifles, not the standard-issue sidearms most rangers carried. "Get in," Tom shouted over the rotor noise. "We're wheels up in 60 seconds." We scrambled aboard, and the pilot pulled up immediately, the ground falling away beneath us. Only when we were 500 feet up and climbing did I finally allow myself to relax slightly. Sarah was shaking beside me, whether from exhaustion or relief or lingering fear, I couldn't tell. Tom handed us both bottles of water. "Okay," he said, "show me what you've got." I pulled out my phone and showed him the footage. He watched in silence, his expression growing darker with each passing second. When it finished, he sat back and rubbed his face with both hands. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "Jesus Christ, Marcus. What the hell is that thing?" "We were hoping you could tell us, sir. I've never seen anything like it. In 30 years of working wildlife, I've never even heard of anything like it." He looked out the window at the forest passing below us. "This is going to cause a shitstorm. You know that, right?" "People need to know," Sarah said firmly. "They have a right to know what's out there." Tom nodded slowly. "You're right. They do. But I need you both to understand something. Once this gets out, once people see this footage, everything changes. There will be panic. There will be demands to close the backcountry, maybe even the whole park. There will be hunters and thrill seekers, and God knows who else trying to get into the Thorofare to find these things. And there will be pressure from very high up to make this disappear. We've already made copies, I said. Multiple copies. We're not letting this get buried. Tom smiled grimly. Good. I would have done the same thing. He leaned forward. Here's what's going to happen. We're flying you to Mammoth Hot Springs headquarters. You're going to give statements to federal law enforcement.
They'll want to confiscate your equipment, your footage, everything. Let them. The official copies will probably disappear into some classified database. But those backups you made, those stay hidden until we see how this plays out. If they try to cover it up, we go to the media. Agreed? We both nodded. The helicopter flew on, carrying us away from the Thorofare and whatever lived there in the shadows between the trees. Below us, the forest stretched endlessly, beautiful and deadly, and full of secrets humans were never meant to uncover. The debriefing at Mammoth Hot Springs lasted 3 days. Sarah and I were separated and questioned individually by a rotating cast of federal agents, park officials, and people in suits who never gave their names or agencies. They were polite but thorough, asking us to recount every detail of our encounter dozens of times, looking for inconsistencies or exaggerations. They took our cameras, our phones, our laptops. They confiscated every piece of equipment we'd used in the Thorofare. A team was sent back to the ranger station to collect anything we might have left behind. They even questioned a helicopter pilot and the other rangers who'd been present during our extraction. But they couldn't take what was already out in the world.
The copies Sarah and I had uploaded to secure servers, the emails we'd sent to journalists and researchers, the files stored in cloud accounts under false names. We didn't tell them about any of that. When they asked if we'd made copies, we said no. When they asked if we'd shared the footage with anyone, we said no. We lied, and we did it convincingly, because we both knew what was at stake. On the 4th day, a man I'll call Mr. Garrison sat down across from me in the small conference room where I'd spent most of my time. He was different from the others, older, with the kind of calm authority that comes from decades in positions of power. He didn't have a notepad or recording device. He just looked at me with tired eyes and spoke quietly. Ranger Webb, I'm going to be honest with you. What you encountered in the Thorofare is something we've been aware of for quite some time. Not just the 15 years of disappearances at Yellowstone. We have documentation going back much further, from multiple national parks and wilderness areas across the western United States. I felt my stomach drop. How much further? The earliest reliable report we have is from 1872, the year Yellowstone was established. But there are Native American accounts that go back centuries. The Shoshone called them the Numuso, the Walking Shadows. Different tribes had different names, but the descriptions are remarkably consistent. He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. These are copies. You can keep them. I think you've earned the right to know what you encountered. I opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were photocopies of old documents, photographs, and reports. One was a journal entry from a U.S. cavalry soldier stationed at Yellowstone in 1886. His description of a demon of the wilderness, tall as 2 men and built like a spider, matched what we'd seen with chilling accuracy.
Another was a report from 1924 about a similar creature in the North Cascades. There were dozens more, all describing the same basic entity, all from remote wilderness areas. Why hasn't anyone done anything? I asked. If you've known about these things for over a century. What would you have us do, Marcus? Garrison interrupted. How do you hunt something that's perfectly adapted to its environment, that seems to have an intelligence comparable to our own, that lives in areas so remote and vast that we can't effectively monitor them? And more importantly, what happens when we tell the public that there are predators in our national parks capable of taking humans, predators we can't protect them from? People have a right to know. Do they? Or do they have a right to enjoy wilderness areas without being paralyzed by fear of something that kills at most 1 or 2 people per year? More people die from bee stings or lightning strikes or falling trees. Should we close all the national parks because nature is dangerous? He leaned back in his chair. I'm not saying our approach has been right. I'm saying there are no good options here. What about the families? The people who've lost loved ones and never gotten answers? Garrison's expression softened. That's the part that keeps me up at night. Every single one of those cases is a tragedy. But telling them the truth wouldn't bring their loved ones back. It would just give them nightmares. I thought about David Brennan's wife, about Emily Rodriguez's family, about Bill Kowalski and all the others who disappeared into the Thorofare. They deserve to know, I said quietly.
even if the truth is terrible. Garrison studied me for a long moment. You're not going to let this go, are you?
Even if I tell you the footage has been classified, even if I strongly suggest that sharing information about these creatures would be detrimental to public safety and possibly to your own career and legal standing. No, sir, I'm not. He smiled, though there was no humor in it. Good. Because honestly, I'm tired of the cover-ups too. I've been dealing with this for 23 years, and the policy of silence has never sat right with me. So here's what's going to happen. Officially, your footage shows a bear attack. That's what will be in the reports. The Thorofare will be temporarily closed for enhanced bear management. The cases of Brennan and Rodriguez will remain open, but will be attributed to wilderness accidents, likely bear-related. And unofficially, I'm not going to try very hard to stop you from sharing whatever information you might have backed up somewhere. And I'm not going to be surprised when, in a few months, some of that information finds its way to researchers who might be able to study these creatures properly. There are scientists who've been trying to get access to this data for years. Maybe it's time we let them try. He stood and offered his hand. I shook it, still trying to process what he was telling me. One more thing, Garrison said as he reached the door. If you ever encounter one of these things again, don't try to film it. Don't try to study it. Just run. Because the thing you saw was hunting alone, which means it was either young or testing a new area. The older ones, the fully mature specimens, you don't want to know what they're capable of. Then he was gone, and I was left alone with the folder and too many questions. Sarah and I were released later that day. We were both placed on administrative leave pending a full review of the incident, which essentially meant we were benched indefinitely.
They couldn't fire us without raising questions, but they could make it clear we weren't wanted in the field anymore. We met for coffee a week later at a diner in Gardner, Montana, just north of the park boundary. She looked as exhausted as I felt, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping any better than I was. I can't stop thinking about it, she said, stirring her coffee absently. Every time I close my eyes, I see that thing climbing toward us. And I keep wondering, how many are there? How many people have they killed that we don't know about? How many remote areas of wilderness are they living in? Garrison gave me a folder, I said quietly. Reports going back to the 1870s. Similar creatures in the Cascades, the Rockies, the Sierra Nevada. Always in the most remote areas, always operating the same way. Hunting in late afternoon, taking people who are alone or in small groups, never leaving bodies. Jesus, Sarah looked out the window at the mountains in the distance. What are we going to do with the footage? I've been thinking about that. If we release it publicly, it'll create panic. People will flood into Yellowstone trying to find these things. Probably get themselves killed. But if we share it with the right researchers, people who take it seriously, who approach it scientifically, maybe they can figure out what these creatures are and how to coexist with them. Do you really think coexistence is possible? Sarah asked. With something that hunts people. We coexist with grizzlies and mountain lions. They kill people occasionally too. It's about understanding their behavior, respecting their territory, taking proper precautions. I paused. Though I'll admit, these things seem more intelligent than any animal I've encountered.
That makes them more dangerous, but maybe also more predictable if we can understand their patterns. Over the next 3 months, Sarah and I carefully distributed the footage to a select group of cryptozoologists, wildlife biologists, and anthropologists we trusted. We released it under pseudonyms, with enough information to verify its authenticity, but not so much that it could be traced directly back to us. The response was mixed. Some dismissed it as an elaborate hoax, but others recognized it for what it was. Our research team from a private wildlife foundation approached us indirectly through intermediaries. They wanted to mount an expedition to the Thorofare to look for physical evidence, tracks, scat, possible nesting sites. They wanted our help planning the expedition, though they understood we couldn't participate directly without violating our administrative leave. We helped them,
We provided detailed maps, information about the creature's hunting patterns, safety protocols. We emphasized that anyone going into that area needed to work in groups, needed to be armed, and needed to avoid the late afternoon hours when the creature seemed most active. The expedition went into the field in October 2019, after the regular tourist season ended. They spent 3 weeks in the Thorofare and came back with evidence we'd only dreamed of. Tracks, huge multi-toed prints unlike any known animal. Samples of what might have been shed skin or molted exoskeleton showing that strange bark-like texture. Recordings of the clicking sounds. And photographs of one of the younger creatures taken from a safe distance with a telephoto lens. They published their findings in a small, specialized journal that most people have never heard of. But it was enough. The scientific community began taking the idea seriously. Funding appeared for further research. And slowly, quietly, the truth began to emerge from the shadows.
As for me, I left the Park Service in January 2020. After what I'd seen, after the lies and cover-ups and bureaucratic cowardice, I couldn't continue working for an organization that valued public perception over public safety. Sarah left too. She's teaching environmental science at a college in Oregon now, still researching the creatures in her spare time. I bought a small cabin in Montana, far from any national parks or wilderness areas. I work as a wilderness survival instructor, teaching people how to stay safe in the backcountry. And I tell my students things that aren't in any official manual. I tell them about the importance of being aware of their surroundings, of trusting their instincts when something feels wrong, of never hiking alone in remote areas during late afternoon. I don't tell them about the creatures, not directly. That would sound crazy, and I'd lose all credibility. But I give them the tools they need to survive if they ever encounter something they can't explain. Sometimes that's the best you can do. The Thorofare is still open to visitors, though these days there are more restrictions and requirements. You need to file detailed itineraries, carry GPS beacons, check in regularly. Mysteriously, ranger patrols have increased in the late afternoon hours. The official reason given is enhanced wildlife monitoring, but those of us who know the truth understand what they're really watching for. There haven't been any disappearances in the Thorofare since Emily Rodriguez. I'd like to think that increased vigilance has made a difference, that the creatures have learned to avoid areas with higher human traffic. But I also wonder if they've simply moved to other parts of the park, or to other wilderness areas where monitoring is less intensive. Because the thing about apex predators is that they don't stop hunting just because their preferred hunting ground becomes more difficult. They adapt, they find new territory, they evolve.
And these creatures have had thousands of years to perfect their methods. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up from dreams of that afternoon in the Thorofare. I see that thing climbing toward us, feel that primal terror of being hunted by something perfectly adapted to kill. And I remember what Garrison said about the mature specimens, about how what we encountered was just a young one. I wonder what a fully grown one looks like. I wonder how intelligent they really are, whether they have language, culture, society. I wonder if they're aware of us watching them now, studying them, trying to understand them. And I wonder if they care. The footage is out there now, circulating in certain circles, impossible to completely suppress. Every few months, someone new contacts me, wanting to know more, wanting to plan their own expedition. I always give them the same advice. Don't go alone. Don't go unarmed. And don't go looking for something that doesn't want to be found. Because the truth is, we're not studying these creatures. They're tolerating our presence in their territory. For now. But nature always has the final say. And the wilderness doesn't care about our need for answers or our desire to categorize and understand everything we encounter. Some things are meant to remain mysterious. Some places are meant to inspire fear as much as wonder. And some creatures are meant to remind us that for all our technology and intelligence, we're still just visitors in their domain. The Yellowstone backcountry belongs to them. It always has. We're just learning to share it, whether we want to admit it or not. I still have the photographs from Garrison's folder. Sometimes I take them out and study them, looking at those old accounts from soldiers and explorers and Native Americans who encountered the same creatures we did.
And I'm struck by how consistent the descriptions are across more than a century. how every witness used similar words to describe something that shouldn't exist. Walking shadows, tree demons, the silent hunters. Different names for the same truth, that there are things in the wild places of America that science hasn't explained, that governments won't acknowledge, and that most people will never believe in until they see them with their own eyes. I've thought about writing this all down properly, publishing it under my real name, being fully transparent about what happened in the Thorofare. But I know what would happen. I'd be dismissed as a crackpot, my credibility destroyed, and the message would be lost in the noise of conspiracy theories and cryptid hysteria. So instead, I'm telling you this story the way I'm telling it now, as a cautionary tale, a piece of wilderness folklore, something that might be true, or might be the product of fear and exhaustion and misidentification. Let people decide for themselves what to believe. But if you ever find yourself hiking in the Yellowstone backcountry, especially in the remote regions like the Thorofare, pay attention to the warnings. If the forest goes suddenly, completely silent in late afternoon, find shelter immediately. If you see something moving between the trees that doesn't look quite right, don't try to get a better look. And if you hear clicking sounds, like bamboo striking bamboo, run. Don't worry about looking foolish. Don't worry about people thinking you panicked over nothing. Just run, and keep running until you're back in areas with other people, with noise and life, and the comforting chaos of civilization. Because there are things out there that our ancestors knew to fear, things that we've forgotten about in our arrogance, and our assumption that we've mapped and tamed and understood all the dangerous creatures of the world. We haven't.
And somewhere in the Thorofare, in the silent forests and shadowed valleys of Yellowstone National Park, they're still hunting.